This is a little awkward to speak into a microphone, so you probably can't hear me though if I'm just speaking like this. No, you can't because of all those other people out there. So I'll do my best with this. Be patient. Those of you who are in the back, though, it might be better if you come up front. There's a lot of empty seats because I can't travel to you very well because I'm a little bit tethered. And I promise I won't bite anybody. So we're here for how to approach a literary agent, correct? Yes? Just a show of hands, so I understand what kind of work you all are concentrating on. How many of you are writing fiction? How about memoir? Strictly memoir. A couple memoir. All right. And then nonfiction. Okay, so we're mainly fiction writers here. I'll talk a little bit about nonfiction and what we need to do when you're trying to sell a nonfiction project, as well as talking about fiction and memoir. But there is a difference. When you are writing a work of fiction or memoir, before you approach anybody, you want to make sure you have a complete manuscript. Nonfiction works a little bit differently, where you can sell an idea off a book proposal. And I'll talk briefly about the elements of a book proposal and what publishers and agents like to see from there. But so it's a little bit different from fiction and memoir. Fiction, you want to make sure that before you go anywhere, you have a good manuscript under your belt. So this is not your first draft attempt. It should be looked at, or memoirs, same thing. I sort of think about the two in terms of how this works as being very similar. So you want to make sure that that manuscript has gone through editing, it's as solid as you can possibly get it before you start shopping it around. Okay? So just keep that in mind. Now, let's talk about, has anybody here had experience with literary agents? No. Okay, so literary agents probably seem like they're a foreign breed or a different species, which is very normal, I would say. We don't come across them very often in our everyday lives. They tend to be concentrated in New York, Boston, sometimes in LA. We do have one agent who's now come to the state of Rhode Island. And if you talk to Steve Porter, he can point you in her direction. Her name is escaping me at the moment. It might come to me as I talk. But in other words, we find agents where we find major publishing houses. And we find major publishing houses in big cities like New York City, where we have Random House, Penguin USA, St. Martin's Press, HarperCollins, Farrar, Straus and Giroux, some of the smaller, big publishing houses. And so an agent's job is to get to know all of the different major publishing houses and the different editors who work for these publishing houses. So a traditional publishing house will employ X number of editors, let's say 20 editors at a large publishing company. Each one of those editors will specialize in a different type of book. For instance, so I worked in, probably should back up for a second and give you a little bit of background about myself. After I graduated with an MFA in fiction writing from Sarah Lawrence, I moved into New York City and started working at St. Martin's Press. And my first job there was as an editorial assistant for a true crime editor, which was not the job I dreamed about when I was a young girl. We published books like Cannibal Killers and Sins of the Mother, about the Susan Smith case where she killed her children. And I have to tell you that title, Sins of the Mother, was my fault because my editor said, we need a title for this manuscript. Come up with 5 titles. And I came up with what I thought were the worst cliched whatever, and he loved all of them, and he loved that one in particular. So anyway, true crime is a very particular genre, but yeah, I didn't last very long working with him. And after that, I moved over to the literary imprint of St. Martin's Press called Picador USA. And I worked for a man named George Whitty, who became the editor-in-chief of St. Martin's. And I was there for about 3 years, and then I moved on to the literary agenting side and worked for an agency called Sobel Weber Associates in New York. And when I was there, I worked on book projects. We worked with magazine writers and short story writers, and we really cultivated an area of agency that hadn't yet been tapped, and that was we wanted to be able to represent local, regional magazine writers and get them national exposure. So we would find, so there's a writer named Will Hilton, whose name you might encounter in GQ or Esquire. Will Hilton was writing for a magazine based in Baltimore, Baltimore Magazine, their equivalent of Rhode Island Monthly. And the agency, we subscribed to all of these regional magazines, and we read them. We actually read local publications. And Will Hilton was such a good writer that we wrote to him and said, do you have any interest in ever gaining national publication? And he came and met with us, and sure enough, we sort of opened the door for him into magazine publishing. Another thing that can happen in the agenting world is, let's say you publish a short story. Let's say you publish a piece in the ARIA anthology, for example. There are agents who keep an eye out for publications like that, and they may read a short piece of your work and write to you and ask if you have a full-length manuscript, especially younger agents. An agent's job is to make your work the best it can be, because that's how they get paid. So an agent takes 15% of a commission of your sale on your work. So let's say they get you an advance of $50,000. They'll take, which is probably aiming very high, but let's just say that. They take 15% of that sale. So they work, you should never have to pay an agent anything. So one thing to look out for is an agent who charges reading fees. So if you're being charged to have your work read and evaluated, that's probably not an agent you want to work with long term. Okay? So that's something to look out for. Agents make their money based on the quality and sale of your work. So they should be working to sell your work, to position your work in the best place it can be, because that's how they will earn their keep. So that's just something to keep in mind. All right, so if you're encountering agents who say that they want to charge you, run the other way. However, there are, sort of before you get to the agenting, or to the agent, there are people like myself who are former publishing industry veterans who work as consultants or writing coaches, and they will help you to get your work where it needs to be in order to approach a literary agent. Those people get paid to read your work because they don't have the opportunity to make a commission. They're not selling your work. They will evaluate it, they'll help edit it, they'll help, and there are a number of them, again, like myself. If you are in need of somebody to do that, on the ARIA website, there's a section that says Author Services, and you can find somebody who can look at your work through that. And one thing I would say is, when you're looking for a consultant, is to make sure you find somebody who has actual industry experience. somebody who's worked in publishing and who's acquired manuscripts, who's represented writers, or who has at least close ties to people who do that, because they're the people who are going to know whether or not your work is actually marketable and what it's going to take in order to make it marketable. So when you're looking for a literary agent, or when you're thinking about approaching one, that's the very first question you should ask yourself. Is my project marketable on a national scale? I think most of us in this room, and I can include myself because I too am a writer, and I said I have an MFA in fiction writing, which is a highly lucrative graduate degree. So I know what it's like to be on the writing side as well as the publishing side. And what I can tell you is that the worst judge of the marketability of our work is ourselves. We tend to think this is going to be the best thing ever, because if we don't think that, why in the world would we continue to write? Or we think this is the worst thing ever, and we keep going, and that sense of self-punishment is what prompts us to continue to write. But we don't have a very realistic view of where our work fits into the bigger picture of the publishing world. And so, and unfortunately, our spouses, our parents, sometimes our children, might not be the best judge either, okay? So if you do know somebody who is familiar with the industry, who can evaluate your work, who can say, I think that this has real potential, go for it, then by all means, make best friends with that person. And do whatever it takes to have them read your manuscript. Don't be shy about that. It's the more readers you can get, obviously, the better. But the more savvy readers you can get, the better. And if you can't find somebody, you can always hire a professional. So that's the first thing. Is your work marketable on a national scale? That means, is somebody in Iowa going to want to read what you've written? Is somebody in Louisiana going to want to read it? Somebody in California? Or does it seem like it's more of a regional appeal that your work has? And if that's the case, there are regional publishers, and you might not want to go with a literary agent who specializes in procuring traditional national publication for you. So that's step one. Know your work and know your market. Once you have been reassured that yes, this is worthy of pursuing the next level, then you want to figure out who represents work similar to yours. So there are hundreds and hundreds of agents out there, hundreds of them. And they all have different tastes, they all have different interests, and you want to figure out who's going to be most inclined to want to read your work. And remember, especially because most of us are fiction writers here, at this stage, we just want to get somebody to read our manuscript. Let alone, so we'll talk about the representation in a moment, but at this point, we want to figure out who would be interested in reading my work of fiction, or my memoir, or my piece of nonfiction. And there are a few ways to go about doing this. One way I strongly suggest you look into is to look at novels that are similar to yours. And if you don't know of any novels that are similar to yours, you need to go and do more market research. Because there are novels similar to yours. Okay, there's very little, I think, that's totally brand new and original and sui generis. I think a lot of writers end up talking to each other in their work. And so you want to know, who are you really talking to in your work? when you have a sense of what work is similar to yours, so let's say my work is similar to, I don't know, Danielle Steele, which it's not by any means, but let's pretend it is. I can go to the library or to the bookstore, open up her books and look at her acknowledgement page and see whether or not she thanks her literary agent. And if she does, I'm going to make a note, okay, this person would be good to approach because she or he reads fast-paced, what do we call Danielle Steele books? Commercial, fast-paced commercial fiction. We'll just call it that for now, okay? Or if you have a mystery, same thing. So someone, or say your work, Dennis Lehane is one of my favorite writers. So I would go into Dennis Lehane's books and say, who's his literary agent? You can always do a Google search, who's Dennis Lehane's literary agent? And write to that person. And in your query letter, you can say, because you represent Dennis Lehane, whose work is similar to my own in its combination of depth of character and what I want to say, mystery, I guess. It's not, I'm shooting from the hip here, so it's not coming to my mind very quickly, but just some description of the writer's work that you're admiring and how it is similar to your own. So that way you show that the agent that you're taking this seriously. You're taking their time seriously. You've thought about this choice seriously, okay? And that it's, your work deserves to be read by this person. Another way to find a literary agent is to scour websites. But that can be tiresome, individual websites. You'll find an agent who says, okay, I represent literary fiction and memoir. But let's say this, but what does that mean? This person might actually concentrate on celebrity memoir, not Joe Schmo from Rhode Island memoir, okay? So again, you want to do some drilling down when you find out, okay, who represents my category or my genre, so let's say it's memoir writing. Once you find agents off their website, you want to look at their client list and the writers that they've worked with. And that will also be posted on the website, okay? And you want to make sure that you're writing to the appropriate people, that you're contacting the appropriate people. How many agents should you approach? So how many of these, right, what kind of list? Well, I suggest querying maybe 10 people at a time, but where that doesn't mean though you're going to get a positive response from any of those 10 people. So the famous story of J.K. Rowling, who went to 100 agents, everybody, it was the last person that she approached who took her on, and look at her now. So I was just speaking with somebody who said he must have contacted 600 people. It takes what it takes. So it's really about stamina and being in this for the long haul. And if you believe in your work and you have other people in your corner who believe in your work and you want to pursue this as far as you can go with it. Hi. Are you bringing pizza for us all? I didn't realize lunch came with this. It's okay. I'm easily distracted, especially when people are hovering over my personal belongings. I'm like, what are you doing over there? Anyway, so now I was thinking about pizza and I got a little bit distracted. Stamina, thank you, obviously. Okay, I need a little work on that. But don't expect that your work is going to be celebrated from the get-go. In fact, set yourself up to be rejected and expect it. The Has anybody heard of James Tate, the poet James Tate? A couple people have. So he won the Pulitzer Prize, I don't know how long ago, a few years ago. But James Tate said, you're not a real writer until you've had 100 rejections. And when he said that, it made me think and this is way back, before grad school, when I was still bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and all of that, wanting to be a writer. It made me think about, oh yeah, the rejection part and learning how to take rejection is probably just as important as being able to finish your manuscript. And so to understand that with every rejection that comes in, that's more street cred, right? This is a sign that you are a real writer. And when you get to that 100th rejection, you can say, okay, now I've made it. It's not the publication that makes you the real writer, it's the 100 rejections. So aim for that. Aim high in terms of that, okay? And don't be afraid. If you have problems with rejection, get into therapy immediately. That will help you, okay? And process this in therapy. Because it's part, and I'm sure you know this by now, and if you haven't learned it yet, you will learn it soon, that rejection is a huge part of what it means to become a writer who wants other people to read your work, other than your friends and family and paid consultants, okay? It's about rejection, being able to withstand rejection, of finding what your niche is. Not everybody is going to like your work. So this is sort of the philosophy and what we think about when we want to approach a literary agent, and how we want to set ourselves up to be prepared for the worst. Because the worst is probably, what we think of the worst, right, is probably what we're going to encounter. But let's say somebody says, your query letter was great, I really want to read your manuscript, and then they read your manuscript, and then they want to represent you. So what does that look like? What's that all about? So an agent is someone who knows the editors, who like your work, who has lunch with those people on a regular basis, who talks to them at cocktail parties and book fairs, the New York or equivalent of the Book Expo we've got going on out here, or writers' conferences. Literary agents are excellent at networking. That's their job. And so you get to write, they network, they know who's appropriate for you, and they will get your manuscript into the hands of people who are most likely to enjoy it and want to publish it. Even then, though, be prepared for rejection, because just because an agent says your work might be suitable for a particular editor doesn't mean that editor is going to feel that way, because maybe they have 3 other books that are just like yours already lined up for publication. Maybe they're going through a divorce and they just can't read another romance novel right now, and so they're going to reject every romance novel they have, and they're going to start concentrating on the how to get a divorce book. You never know. You never know what goes on. And this is why it's important to be steeled for rejection and not to take it personally at all. But let's say your agent finds an editor who wants to buy your book. That agent will then negotiate a contract with the publishing house for the publication of your work. That contract will involve certain things. It will cover what's called the royalty rate. It will cover the advance you receive. So when you receive an advance from a traditional publishing house, that's an advance against royalties. So your book, let's say you get that $50,000 advance. That advance that means your book has to sell enough copies to cover $50,000 in royalties. So if your royalty rate, let's say, is $1.25 a copy, I can't do the math right now. Think about how many copies you would have to sell in order to do what's called earning out your advance. You'd have to sell a lot of copies. So that agent will negotiate all of this for you. They will also negotiate on your behalf in terms of what's called subsidiary rights. So paperback rights they might go to the original publisher, or perhaps the agent says, oh no, this is so hot, we're going to keep our paperback rights, and then we're going to have an auction for the paperback. And we're going to get a whole different group of publishers involved at that point. Subsidiary rights, large print, translation rights, film, electronic media. There are, and it seems like, every few months there's a different subset of subsidiary rights that becomes possible for the agent to break into on your behalf. And so the agent also keeps up on the trends in publishing, which those of us who are sitting in the library or at a cafe or at our desks don't. It's the agent's job to do that for you. And to get for you as many of these subsidiary sales as possible. Why? Remember that 15% that the agent sells, that the agent makes on your behalf? So the more of these subsidiary sales they make, the more goes into their pocket. Which is why they want to choose projects that are going to have these wide appeals, that will have not just that initial publication. Sorry, it's hard for me to compute. I appreciate that you're here. Oh, nope, somebody's going for the women's fiction. Okay. There we go. Okay. So the agent's job is to make sure that it's not just that initial sale that's where, oh, he's back. That is rock solid, but that there's potential for all these other sales. The other thing an agent might ask you about is whether or not you have any other books in the works. So if you are a one and done kind of writer, unless it's like, did anybody read The Secret History by Donna Tartt? Right, a long time ago. She was a girl wonder and made a huge advance, and then it took her, I don't know how long, for the next 10 years for the next book. That's very rare. That's very rare. An agent will want to know, what are you working on next? While I'm selling this, you better be working on the next project. Okay? So if you want to write only one book in your whole entire life, you might not be a good prospect for literary representation unless your book is huge, like The Secret History ended up being. And you happen to know Bret Easton Ellis personally, like she did. So she had connections in that instance as well, right? That helped get her published. So subsidiary sales, your agent will negotiate all of that. Your agent will also answer all of your questions about what goes on in the mysterious realm of publishing. Your agent is not going to necessarily, and it really depends on personality. Some agents are more business-like than others, and they'll answer your phone call, or maybe you'll get to talk to their assistants rather than the agent themselves. Other agents will happily take you out for drinks on a regular basis, or have lunch with you regularly, right, and keep you informed, talk to you. And so you might also, when you're choosing who your literary agent, whom you're approaching, look for, if you can, any stories, any kind of informal stories about how these agents operate. And what sort of person are you looking for? Because if you know, right, it might not be a good fit for you if you feel like, I'm just going to end up in this factory situation, and I really need somebody who's more of a boutique agent who can give me some one-on-one, much more one-on-one time than somebody who's working for, let's say Molly Friedrich, for example. Okay, so that's, again, a little bit more of the broad overview. Any questions before I get into the query letter and the nuts and bolts of a book proposal? Yes?
What's the range that a consultant might charge?
That really depends on the consultant.
Ballpark?
The highest rate I've heard so far was for someone who consulted on a memoir project. She charges $800 per 100 pages of manuscript. So if you have a 400-page manuscript, she would charge you $3,200 just to read it and critique it. Yeah. So that's on the high end, okay? Somebody else might charge, let's say, a dollar rate per page. So anywhere from like my rates, I would say I charge generally $1 to $5 per page. Sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. It really depends. And when I say per page, that's manuscript page, which roughly evens out to about 250 words. So you may single space and put your stuff in 10 points and say, well, this is a manuscript page, but I go by the industry standard, which is so one published page equals approximately 250 words. So it doesn't matter what your actual manuscript page looks like. Other consultants will go just on a general word count. So really, it varies.
How do you think agents would view indie authors in a query letter? Is that something they would be excited about, or would they feel that's a negative?
That you're an indie author, meaning you're self-published already? It depends on the national appeal of your work, and also your media platform, your sales figures to date. What have you done? I don't think that it's necessarily a strike against you, like it used to be. There used to be more stigma around it, but now I think it's very different because people have phenomenal sales on their own. And why wouldn't a traditional publisher want to get in on that? So I think it really depends on the project. I wouldn't worry too much about being self-published and whether that's a strike against you. As long as you have a project that's marketable on a national stage and that fits what a traditional publisher can do. Somebody was also talking about, the person who said he approached just about 600 agents. He said, I'm really tired of doing this like self-promotion thing. Well, guess what? You get an agent, you get a publisher, guess what you're going to be doing? Self-promotion. You might have a publicist who will book you venues to do that self-promotion. But it's your job to show up for your work and to sell your work. And so a publisher or an agent is going to want to know whether or not you're capable of that job. All right. Anything else before we talk about the query letter? Yeah.
Copyright issues. When do you do them? When does that come into play?
Which issue?
Like just getting a copy written to you. Do you do that before you start sending it out? Like when does that?
Copyright or
like
copy?
Actually going and getting copy before copyright.
Getting it copyrighted. That would be at the time of publication. Would be something. So if you're going through a literary agent, that would be something that would be negotiated in the contract. Who owns the copyright? Is it the publisher or does the author retain the rights?
So that's not something you do before you start sending your manuscript out?
No. Your work technically is automatically copyrighted as soon as you put it on the page. Okay? When you're submitting to professionals, to literary agents who understand that, copyright should not be an issue. And if you're worried about copyright, I think that says that it gives off an amateurish air, I guess is what I would say. And so I would make sure before you include anything like that, that's something you'd want to be included in a letter. Okay? But generally, I wouldn't worry about that at this point until it goes to publication. Because once it goes to publication, it's going into mass production, presumably. And at that point, yes, absolutely, somebody will own the copyright. Yeah?
What can you tell us about the push and pull between author and agent or author and editor when it comes to content? Who wins those matters?
Let's talk about the query letter. And then we'll go back to this question, okay? Because I think that question is loaded, and it might be something we want to talk about afterward. Who wins those back? It depends. It depends. And that's something also that can be negotiated in a contract, that any change or any editing has to be approved by the author, or that the author also gives up any review rights, okay, and trust the publisher to make the change. So that's something that can get negotiated. So when we write a query letter, so how do we, now we've narrowed down who our agent is that we want to approach. We know that they represent, that this person represents, or these people represent the type of work that we're writing, and so we want to write to them. These days, I would say 99% of literary agents will take an email query, so you don't need to worry about sending something in with a self-addressed stamped envelope. Remember the days of the SASEs, right? The SASEs, those are kind of over, unfortunately. There's something sort of satisfying about it, but those days are over. So in a query letter, we're sending an email. You want to, there are a few tips here that I just want to make sure I remember all of them, so I'm consulting my notes, which now I've taken all out of order. But one thing is, you want to address your agent by name. That's kind of, dear agent, or to whom it may concern. You want to make sure that you're using their name. And unless you know for sure in this day and age what pronoun that agent wants to be referred to by, I would suggest you not make assumptions about Mr., Ms., Mrs., anything like that, and just use the agent's full name. Dear Molly Fredericks. Okay? That's perfectly acceptable. But you want to make sure that you're using the name. And once you've done that, you want to think about, okay, what is the function of your query and what's the length? Your query should be brief. It should be about a page, not much longer than that. Sometimes people will have the query letter and then also include a synopsis of their manuscript, their work, but that synopsis should be considered separate from the query letter. So your query letter should not include the entire plot outline of your work. It should include a description of it, but not the entire plot outline. You can save that for something separate. So think about 2 to 3 paragraphs, which means sometimes takes longer to write than a longer letter. So one of my favorite quotes is from Abraham Lincoln in one of his letters to a friend. He said, "Forgive me for writing such a long letter. I didn't have time to write a short one." So it often takes us longer to write a short piece than a longer piece. So just because your query letter is short doesn't mean it's easy to just dash off. So you want to begin by introducing yourself. So, dear so-and-so, I'm writing in hopes that you will consider my novel called The Best Novel in the World. I am a writer based in Rhode Island. I've been writing for approximately 15 years. My short fiction has won these awards. I've also taught at these places. And I have experience with social media and marketing through these avenues, through my work in advertising. So in other words, whatever experience you have that you think is relevant in any way to not only publishing your book, but marketing it and promoting it, feel free to include that. So if you've done website design, include that. If you have a blog about life with your pets, include that. Right? Anything that shows that you know how social media works and you are willing to be a public presence is helpful. Generally, I would do it right away. Yeah, but there's no hard and fast rule as long as the letter makes sense. But right off the bat, if I see, okay, this person is writing to me, they have writing experience, they have publicity experience, okay, they've got my attention, what's the project? Because an agent is going to want to know not just about the book, you actually are the commodity that the agent is interested in. And so if you have great credentials, put those first, by all means. And they don't have to be publication credentials. Like I said, they can be related to other aspects of publicity or publishing. And most likely, as I've said before, the person reading your query is not the agent, him or herself, or themselves. It's the poor, tired, literary agent's assistant who's overworked and gets hundreds of queries every day. And so you want to make sure that you're getting by that first line of defense there. And the more you can appeal to that poor, tired literary assistant, right? They pull your query out, they print it, or they forwarded it on to the literary agent, but they basically act as a screener because the agent would be way too overwhelmed otherwise. And then, so your next paragraph is a description of your project. So you want to mention the title and a few words of description. What is your book about? You also, if it's nonfiction, you want to talk about what its theme, audience, approach, purpose, overall content, and how it differs from other books on the same topic, if there are other books on the same topic. Okay? How does my book on wedding planning differ from all the other titles out there? Okay? My book on wedding planning incorporates the use of pet therapy as a necessary adjunctive for sanity, whatever it is, okay? As we know, pet therapy is very much in the news these days because of X, Y, and Z. So my work is unique in the way it blends wedding planning and pet therapy. That's for nonfiction work. For fiction, you want to do a brief overview of the genre. So you're writing romance, you're writing science fiction, you're writing mystery, you're writing literary fiction, you're writing mainstream commercial fiction, whatever it is. And if you don't know what your genre is, you want to find out, and that's something that a consultant can help you with. And then give a sentence or two, just a sentence or two of a plot description. You don't need to go into a lot of detail about it. Okay? And again, if your work is similar to somebody else's work, like Danielle Steele, my work looks at lifestyles of the rich and famous. But my work also includes a look at how the rich and famous utilize pet therapy in their marriage, whatever it is. So how is your work slightly different from, again, even the other novels that are out there? And for memoir, I would also suggest, again, that you keep it brief, because you are probably way more interested in your story than anybody else on the planet. And so by showing that you're capable of practicing a little bit of restraint in your query letter right off the bat, your agent will be thankful that you're not giving every twist and turn in that query letter. And then you want to think about what makes your work unusual, or what special experience you have had or that you have that informs your work. So there are things that you do not want to include in a query letter. So if you've already written to 50 literary agents and they've all passed, you don't want to include that 50 literary agents have all read it and rejected it, essentially. You don't, it's nobody's business. Nobody needs to know that. Unless you have a quote from a well-known writer or somebody who's well-established, you don't need to include what anybody else has said about your work, right? My mother said that this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and she should know because she invented sliced bread. That, leave it out, okay? But if you have a friend of a friend who can get you a quote from a writer who's relatively well respected and well known, by all means include it. You do not want to tell the agent how long and how hard you've worked on your book. That should be a given, right? Your agent should not have to hear about that. They're busy. You don't need to acknowledge other people for their help in your project. You don't need to do that in a query letter. And you also want to refrain from admitting that a proposal or any kind of sample that you include is in less than ideal shape. So you want to make sure that your work, what you're submitting to this agent, is the best work it can be. And if it's not, you don't want to tell them that it's not. Why? It's not going to get past that screener right away. You also don't want to solicit comments or feedback from the agent. So any feedback or suggestions you have for revision would be welcome. No, that's not the agent's job. The agent's job is simply to say, yes, I want to read this, or no, I don't, thank you very much. The agent's job is not to say, hey, I really liked your work, but could you do X, Y, and Z? If you do get that kind of feedback, consider it a gift, and that means that your work was taken seriously. But don't expect it and don't ask for it. You also want to refrain from telling the agent how thrilled you would be if your work were published. That's also a given. And anything about your life that is not strictly relevant to your submission, leave it out, okay? So if I am not going to talk about pet therapy in my work, then I won't tell the agent that I have 2 dogs at home. And I'm in therapy to deal with rejection, right? I won't, yeah, absolutely not. I will not tell the agent that. I want to present myself as a professional. I also, in the query letter, do not include anything about the rights you're looking to sell. It's way too soon. You're putting the cart before the horse, so you don't need to spend their time in your query letter including that. And you want to refrain from telling the agent how much money you'd like to get for your book. Right, so you don't want to say something like, I will not sell this perfect novel for anything less than a $50,000 advance. That's not your job at that point. So the purpose of your query letter is to interest the agent enough to ask for the manuscript, the full-length manuscript, if it's a work of fiction or memoir, or to ask for a proposal. Okay? That's the job of your query. And then when that happens, you can celebrate and get prepared for rejection. And then if it doesn't get rejected at that point, right, celebrate and then get prepared for more rejection, because the agent might have taken it on, but that agent may never sell it. So just because you found a literary agent is not a guarantee of publication. It's heartbreaking to agents alike when a work that they believe in doesn't get picked up. It's heartbreaking, but it happens. Okay? So there's no guarantee of publication until publication. And then you want to close your query letter just by thanking them for their time and consideration and giving your contact information. It's really pretty simple. So that's approaching the literary agent. And we had a couple, I just want to double check time here, so we have about 10 minutes. Do people want to hear about what's included in a book proposal? Or we want a couple people to? All right, so quickly, what's in a book proposal? Basically, a sample book proposal. Let's say you want to write about, I'm just looking here, okay. You want to write about pet therapy. No, let's take a step back. You want to write about how to handle rejection and why pet therapy is so important in handling rejection. So this is a how-to book. It's nonfiction. So your proposal should be about 40 to 50 pages. You don't need to complete the whole entire thing. But you should include a book proposal cover letter, which is about the book idea, why the market needs this book, this particular book, who's the audience, and what's the market, and then your author bio, highlighting any kind of platform you have, social media experience, etc. So it's very similar to the query letter that you've written. But this will be included by the agent in the submission of the proposal. You also want to include in that cover letter when you anticipate the finished book will be done, how long it will be, what formatting you envision it to have. So if it's a coffee table book, you want to talk about, okay, it's this size, trim size, it will have color photographs and illustrations, etc. And also, if you have a particular style or tone that you're trying to achieve with the work, you can include a description of that as well. And then also in that cover letter, you talk about what the rest of the proposal includes. So an introduction, sample chapters, etc. So next, that's your cover letter. Then you have an overview of the proposed book, right, which is basically a synopsis, although some of it isn't finished yet. You'll also want to include your author bio, which will be another page, separate page. And then you want to identify the audience and the market for the book. So you'll show that you know the market and who your potential readers are. And if possible, you also want to give give your reader a sense of how many potential readers there are for your work. You've identified that there are approximately 1.5 pet therapists across the country who specialize in rejection, right? So those therapists and their clients are, and each one of those 1.5 million pet therapists has approximately, I don't know how many clients. Do the math, and there you have potential readers. So that's basically how you can do a very quick guesstimate of who your audience might be. The other thing you want to do is look at the competition for your book. And you want to show that you know what else is out there. So you've looked on Amazon, you've gone to the bookstore, you know what other titles are out there, and you know how your work is different and ideally better than everything else that's there. And then after that, you include your sample chapters. And so your sample chapters might include an introduction to the project and then your first few chapters. And that might be, before the sample chapters, you also want an annotated table of contents. So what you're envisioning for the whole thing in terms of the table of contents, okay? And then you might have an introduction, you might have your first 2 chapters, or you might have chapters 5 and chapter 8 in your sample. It really depends on what you think your strongest work is and what will highlight the saleability of it to your agent. And when your agent sees the proposal and likes it, they might say, I like it, but I want to see chapters 1 and 2 versus 5 and 8. So that you work on the final proposal that goes out to the editor with the agent. Agents sometimes act as editors on your behalf. They may do the editing work. They may hire a freelancer to help you with an edit because they like your idea so much, or some agents just say, okay, if it's not in great shape by the time it hits my desk, then I'm not going to take on an editing job. So it really varies, but some editors will give you, some agents will give you feedback And then you sell it to an editor, and the editor says, guess what, I want more edits. So really this whole process is one giant exercise in tolerating rejection and Buddhist detachment. So, and if you can't do either of them, find a therapist, preferably who works with pets. So that's all I have to say. But we do have a few minutes left for questions. Anybody, did I cover everything? Yes. There's a book called Writer's Marketplace that lists all the agents out there and gives an overview of what they update it every year. So yes, there are guidelines like that. Anything else? I never know if it's like everybody's really tired at the end of this or I covered everything. So I'm just going to assume I covered everything I needed to cover. All right? Great. Well, thank you all. Enjoy the rest of the expo. And if you have any questions, I'll be here for a little bit